Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is D back again with another movie review, and this movie review is for the 1996 film William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Now, this movie stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes as the main titular characters of the film, and there's a very large and pretty talented supporting cast that includes people like John Leguizamo. Jamie Kennedy is in this, and also let me quickly pull up who else is in this. Paul Rudd, of course, is in this. Dash Minogue, Harold Perrineau. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name, but I know he was also in the Matrix films as well. So even if I don't always recognize his name, definitely recognize the face of that actor, and just many other talented people in the cast. But anyway, so this film, William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. This movie was something that I wasn't interested back in the day when it was kind of really out in theaters and all those type of things. It wasn't really a film that caught my attention at all, but I was very well aware of it. But recently I decided to give it a watch. I kind of became intrigued by seeing what they did in terms of how they adapted the traditional Romeo and Juliet story and then brought that into the modern day setting, and just I wanted to see what they did stylistically. And there were a few scenes and shots that I've seen in passing from the film that looked really good, and I'm very much into cinematography and aesthetics and how a film looks and whatnot. So that caught my attention. So I said, let me give this a watch. And so I went ahead, gave this a watch recently, and my takeaways. Checking my focus. I'm always checking my focus. Whatchamacallit. So my takeaways from this movie. I enjoyed this movie in the beginning portions of the film because it was so, for me, maybe not for everybody else that has seen the film, but for me it was pretty new, refreshing, and relatively different. So I was enjoying the new experience that the movie kind of was. There was a very surreal, dreamlike nature to the movie where it walks this line between a fantasy world and kind of a realistic, real world situation. And I think the Shakespearean type language really kind of pushed it in that direction even more so, because you're hearing this very kind of classical style of speaking. And then it's taking place in, mid 90s type surroundings with guns, these very flashy engraved firearms that all of the the Capulets and the Montagues carry around. So it's a very surreal, otherworldly vibe to the film, and I liked that part, at least in the beginning portions of the movie. Now, what I will say, and this is very important to the review and to my opinion, because it shapes kind of what you should potentially even think of my opinion and how serious you should actually take it. I've never been a fan of that traditional Romeo and Juliet story. Like, it's never caught my attention, even back in school. When it would come up, and we would go over it for whatever class it may have been at the time. It never really was anything I was into. It never caught my interest as being particularly good or enthralling or anything like that. So it was kind of one of those things. I don't have the love for that story that a lot of other people seem to have for it. And that really affected how much I was able to enjoy this movie. I was intrigued by the stylistic choices early on, being introduced to the world that this movie was taking place in. That was very interesting to me. But the actual story, the love story, and the social situation between Romeo and Juliet, and even between the two families, the Capulets and the Montagues, that didn't interest me at all. So eventually that all wore thin. I didn't have any type of investment or love for the source material, admittedly. So I just wasn't really able to completely truly walk away from the movie saying I liked the movie. What I walk away from the movie with is that there's a lot of shots, there's a lot of scenes and moments that I liked and thought looked pretty good, were pretty cool choices and whatnot. But just overall, the film wasn't able truly to hit home for me because I never was into that story. And it really is, for the most part, there are some kind of creative changes to the original story, but for the most part, it is that traditional kind of Shakespearean Romeo and Juliet story that, like I said, they use the original Shakespeare language. And that also, because I was never into that original story, using that Shakespearean language eventually really wore thin. Like eventually I got tired of hearing it because I already knew the story. Like I already knew the outcome of the story, where things were leading to, everything, and I never was in love with the story like that. So there was zero kind of intrigue for me once I got used to and eventually over the kind of the excitement of seeing the new world that this story was now being set in, and kind of that otherworldly dreamlike vibe that was happening early on, and I guess was happening throughout the whole film. But eventually I kind of, I got over that. That wasn't enough to keep me enthralled with the film. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you already were a fan, checking my focus again, if you already were a fan of the original kind of Romeo and Juliet story, well then I think you might be able to really enjoy this movie, because it is basically that same story, just set in a different setting. In this setting that it's set in, this kind of modern day setting, it is a modern day setting, but it's still amped up. It's still a very kind of overstimulated version of modern day, or at least what was modern day for 96. The camera angles, lots of dynamic camera angles, some creative camera angles. The camera's constantly doing things, it felt like, in this movie. The characters were very bombastic, theatrical, fittingly theatrical, and just kind of exaggerated in certain points, but it fit with the material and with what the story was trying, the performances of the story were trying to do. Also, I will point out Leonardo DiCaprio, even in this is pre-Titanic. This is like a year or so before Titanic came out. Titanic came out in 97, I believe. It's still clear that Leo is a star. Like his kind of star power still comes across even at a young age, and I knew that back then. Even I remember seeing the Basketball Diaries for the first time, and some of his other work. I know about What's Eating Gilbert Grape and all that type of stuff. Whatchamacallit. So he does stand out as clearly being a star, and clearly being just a very talented, even at a young age. You can tell he's a talented actor. Claire Danes she does well here enough. I mean, she does perform well. It's just a thing. I really didn't care anything about the story in terms of the romantic relationship between Romeo and Juliet. I was not here for that at all. So it was kind of anything involving Claire Danes in terms of how I want to judge her performance. She wasn't bad as an actress, so I guess she did fine. But since I didn't care about the romantic story between the two, it was almost like it didn't really matter what she did, as long as she just wasn't a horrible actress, and she wasn't. So she does good here, and I've seen her in other projects as she gets older, and I do enjoy her as a performer. But yeah, so that's my final takeaway, Romeo and Juliet. Check it out for sure if you haven't seen it. Check it out if you are a fan of the Romeo and Juliet story. If you're not a fan of that story, or let me say, if you're not familiar with the story, then it could go either way. You might still like this, you might not. Now, if you're not a fan of the Romeo and Juliet story at all, then I actually wouldn't even really recommend this movie, because the story is front and center in this film. So if you really aren't into the story, there's not going to be a whole lot for you to kind of truly enjoy about this movie beyond the aesthetic choices, the kind of stylistic choices. If you want to just watch the movie to study some of that, then you will be able to see some kind of, there's some beautiful shots, some camera shots, cinematography, camera movements, things like that. Then there is something to gain from the film in that regard. Now, before I close this out, I want to make a kind of a comparison, and it might seem kind of like it doesn't make sense, but maybe it kind of does. But stylistically, this movie reminded me a lot of 1994's The Crow. And I think it's because of the camera, lots of dynamic camera angles, camera movements that remind me of The Crow. The only thing is this movie is obviously much more kind of colorful than The Crow is. The Crow is just a very dark, dreary, black, gray, and some red and lots of rain. That's what The Crow film is. Whereas this movie, it's a lot more, there's a zaniness to it. It dabbles into the dark a little bit, but it's really not quite as dark as nowhere near as dark as The Crow, and just lots more of color, vibrant colors and things like that involved in this film, and to a degree even like just straight up humor and whatnot. There's lots more of that in this film than there is in The Crow. But the kind of dynamic camera angles and some of the energy, I think a part of that is because the films are from very similar eras, 96 and 94. Stylistically and just energy wise, that's not very far apart. 2 years difference, you're still within the same kind of era in terms of fashion and music and just what was popular in terms of film and cinematography and what the directors and whatnot were doing. So yeah, The Crow is an interesting, I know it's kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, but some of you might be able to see the similarities just in terms of what the camera is doing, and even some of the attire, even some of the wardrobe and whatnot. The only difference really is that The Crow is much darker in terms of color palette. So that's it, you guys. That is my review for William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. I got to see how this review turns out in the edit. I'm gonna be honest, I don't feel too good about it right now because I don't know how everything's working with the camera and whatnot, but we will see. So until the next time, I will catch you on the next go round.